The deceased female, found headless in Fort Thomas, Kentucky, presents multiple lacerations across the dorsal region and both hands. Evidence strongly suggests decapitation was performed while the subject was still living. She was approximately 5 months with child.
A frozen February morning. A 17-year-old farmhand is just doing his rounds, and then he stops, because something is wrong with the field. Something is very, very wrong. What he finds, headless, frost-covered, alone, will set off one of the most sensational criminal cases America had ever seen. And the worst part? The killers thought they'd gotten away with it. They nearly did.
She told us she was going to visit a friend in Indianapolis. She kissed Mother. She waved goodbye from the road. That was the 28th of January. We never saw her again. Not whole.
Pearl Bryan was 22 years old, Sunday school teacher, farmer's daughter, the kind of girl her town was proud of. She had a secret, a pregnancy, a romance hidden from everyone who loved her, and she trusted the wrong man with it. A dental student named Scott Jackson, who decided that the easiest solution to his problem was to make Pearl disappear entirely. Not just dead, gone, unidentifiable. He and his roommate drugged her drink with cocaine at a Cincinnati saloon, crossed state lines, and left her in a Kentucky field without her head. They burned it, police later theorized, in the furnace of their own dental college.
Identification was made possible not by the face, which had been removed, but by a manufacturer's tag found inside the victim's custom-made shoes, traced to a cobbler in Greencastle, Indiana. The killers overlooked her feet.
They planned everything and forgot the shoes. That tag, one small label sewn into the leather, unraveled all of it. The name, the town, the man she'd been seeing, everything. It's almost poetic in the darkest possible way. You can take someone's face. You cannot take their story. Pearl Bryan left home believing someone who claimed to love her would protect her. Instead, he erased her, or tried to. Her head has never been found. To this day, what remained of her was identified by the shoes on her feet and buried without the rest of herself in a family plot in Indiana. She deserves more than a footnote. If you believe that forgotten victims still deserve a voice, subscribe, share this, comment where you're watching from, because Pearl Bryan's story has been whispered in folk songs and ghost legends for over 100 years. And it's time the world finally listened properly. Greencastle, Indiana, was the kind of town that believed in itself. Not loudly, not in the way cities do with noise and ambition spilling out onto the streets, but quietly, firmly, the way a well-built fence believes in itself. It had its farmers, its churchgoers, its courthouse square. It had DePauw University up on the hill, which gave the whole place a faint air of respectability, like a man who wears a tie to supper, even when no one's coming over. And it had the Bryans. Alexander Bryan was a farmer, well regarded, the sort of man whose handshake meant something. His family meant something too. And of all the things the Bryan family had to be proud of, Pearl was at the top of the list. She was 22, not a child, not yet settled into the particular quietness of a woman whose life has already been decided for her. She'd graduated from Greencastle High School, no small thing for a girl in the 1890s, and she'd found her place teaching Sunday school, standing in front of rows of freshly combed children and telling them stories about faith and goodness. People liked Pearl. Of course they did. She had that quality that some people carry without even knowing it, the kind of warmth that makes a room feel slightly better for having her in it. Her shoes were custom made. That detail matters. Remember it. In a world where most women wore whatever the general store carried, Pearl Bryan had shoes made specifically for her, tagged by a cobbler in Greencastle, fitted to her particular feet. It was a small luxury, a quiet signal that her family loved her, that she was, in the particular language of small Indiana towns, cared for. Nobody in Greencastle would have guessed she was keeping a secret that was slowly, quietly crushing her. His name was Scott Jackson. He was studying dentistry at the Ohio College of Dental Surgery in Cincinnati, which sounds respectable, and was meant to. Jackson was the type who wore his ambition on the outside, polished and presentable,
the kind of young man parents approved of on first meeting. He and Pearl had been carrying on a romance for months, in secret, across the distance between Greencastle and Cincinnati. Letters, visits, whatever they could manage. It is not hard to imagine how it felt. The excitement of it, the danger of it, the particular intoxication of loving someone your family doesn't know about. But by the autumn of 1895, the romance had produced something that couldn't be kept secret much longer. Pearl was pregnant, 5 months along by the time February came. And in 1896, in a small Indiana town where your family's name meant everything, where the women at church noticed the cut of your dress and the length of your hem, an out-of-wedlock pregnancy wasn't a private problem. It was a public catastrophe, the kind that followed a family for generations. So Pearl did what desperate people do. She trusted the father. She reached out to Jackson, told him the situation, asked, begged, probably, though the word beg is one she never would have used, for help, for a solution, for some path through the wreckage that didn't end with her parents' faces falling apart. What Jackson told her we don't know exactly, but whatever he said, she believed it. She packed a bag, she planned a story, and she kept loving him. That part is important too, and terrible. January 28th, 1896, a Tuesday. Pearl told her family she was going to Indianapolis to visit a friend. It was a reasonable lie, unremarkable, the kind of errand young women ran. Her mother probably helped her with her coat. Her father probably gave her money for the journey and told her to write when she arrived. She kissed them. She walked out the door. There's something unbearable about that image if you sit with it long enough. A young woman in custom-made shoes, 5 months pregnant, carrying the full weight of a secret she hasn't told her family, walking away from the last safe place she will ever stand. She didn't know that.
Of course. That's the cruelest part. She thought she was walking toward a solution, toward Cincinnati, toward Jackson, toward whatever plan he'd told her would make this right. The farmhouse behind her, the flat winter fields of Indiana stretching out in every direction, gray and bare and waiting for spring. Her breath in the cold air, and then the road, and then the distance, and then gone. She was heading into the hands of a man who had already decided she was a problem to be solved. 3 days later, January 31st, Pearl was in Cincinnati. The details of exactly where she stayed, who she saw, how those 3 days passed between Greencastle and the saloon are lost now. What we know is this. By the evening of the 31st, she was sitting in a dimly lit bar with Scott Jackson and his roommate, a fellow dental student named Alonzo Walling. Walling. Remember that name too. He wasn't the architect of what happened. That was Jackson's design. But he was there. And in the law's eyes, that was enough. Whether he was a willing participant from the start or a man who got in too deep to climb back out, nobody can say for certain. What can be said is that he sat across from a pregnant woman who trusted his friend, and he did what he was asked. At some point that evening, cocaine was slipped into Pearl's drink. It sounds almost clinical when you say it that way. A drug, a glass, a decision made somewhere in the cold part of a man's mind where empathy doesn't reach. Cocaine in the 1890s wasn't the taboo it is now. It was in tonics, in medicines, available over the counter. But it wasn't in Pearl's drink by accident. The stomach analysis that came later would confirm it. They dosed her deliberately, carefully, in a busy Cincinnati saloon where the gas lights flickered and the noise of other people's evenings filled the air around them. What did Pearl feel? Did the room tilt a little? Did she think she was tired or ill, or simply that the warmth of the saloon after the cold outside was making her dizzy? Did Jackson refill her glass and smile at her across the table, the way men smile when they've already made up their minds? She trusted him, even then, right up until she couldn't. Later that night, they took her across the river into Kentucky, into the dark. Johnny Hewling was 17 years old, a farmhand. He had no reason to expect anything unusual about the morning of February 1st. Just another gray winter day in Fort Thomas, Kentucky, cold ground underfoot, the kind of cold that sits in the bones. He was doing what farmhands do at that hour, moving through the back fields behind what is now a YMCA, when he saw something in the grass that stopped him completely. A woman, lying still. No head. 17 years old, and that is what he found. Whatever Johnny Hewling was before that morning, he was different after it. You don't see something like that and remain entirely the same person. He ran. He told someone. The word spread the way terrible news always does, fast and then faster. The coroner arrived. He documented what he saw with the flat precision of a man whose job requires him to look at things other people look away from. The wounds on her back, the wounds on her hands, defensive wounds, the kind you get when you are fighting, when you are still alive and still fighting. And the decapitation itself, performed, he determined, while she was conscious, while she could still feel it. She was 5 months pregnant. She was lying in a Kentucky field. She was 22 years old, and she had no face for anyone to identify. That, of course, was the point. Jackson had thought it through. No face, no name, no way to connect a body in Kentucky to a girl from Greencastle, Indiana. It should have worked. It very nearly did. Except for the shoes. Custom made, tagged by a cobbler in Greencastle, fitted to Pearl Bryan's particular feet. Overlooked, somehow, in all the careful, terrible planning. A detail so small it barely registers, until it's the only thing that matters. Investigators traced the tag back to Indiana in days. The cobbler knew his work. He knew those shoes. He knew who wore them. And just like that, the girl in the Kentucky field had a name again. Jackson was arrested. Then, under questioning, he did what cornered men often do. He looked sideways and pointed at someone else. Alonzo Walling, he said, his roommate, his fellow student, also involved. The two men began the ancient, ugly choreography of shared guilt, each insisting the other held more of it, each trying to occupy the smaller shadow. It didn't work for either of them. The evidence was clear enough without a confession. Pearl's stomach contents confirmed the cocaine. The shoe tag confirmed her identity. And Jackson's months-long secret romance with her was no longer secret at all. Every letter, every visit, every lie he'd told unraveled in the light of a murder investigation. The romance he'd hidden so carefully became the very thing that hanged him. But there was still the matter of the head. This is where the case tips from terrible into something almost surreal, where the investigation takes on the quality of a dark fever dream. Men in coats dredging rivers in the middle of winter, while two dental students spun stories from their jail cells.
Jackson said the head was at the bottom of the Ohio River. Then he said it was in a sandbar near Dayton, Kentucky. Then somewhere else. Walling offered his own versions, equally vague, equally useless. They drained sections of the Covington Waterworks. They searched stretches of the Miami and Erie Canal. Investigators waded through February cold, following directions given by men who were almost certainly making it up as they went, buying time, watching authorities exhaust themselves, chasing ghosts. The head was never in any of those places. Both men knew that. They let the searches happen anyway. The answer, if it is an answer, came much later. In 1937, a former Cincinnati detective named Cal Krim offered his theory, quietly, to anyone who would listen. He believed Jackson and Walling had used the furnace at the Ohio College of Dental Surgery, the very institution where they studied, where they were trained to understand the human body, where the fires burned hot enough and long enough to make evidence simply disappear. Nobody could prove it. Nobody ever has. The head of Pearl Bryan has never been found. Not in the river, not in the canal, not anywhere. 130 years later, that fact still sits uncomfortably in the chest if you think about it too long. The trials, when they came, were everything Victorian America wanted and feared at the same time. Local newspapers called it the trial of the century, which, to be fair, it was only 1896, so the century had plenty of time left to produce worse. But they weren't entirely wrong. The courtroom drew crowds the way disasters do. The case had everything: a young woman, a secret pregnancy, 2 educated men, a missing head. It was theatrical in the way only true horror can be theatrical, the kind of story that makes people feel righteously horrified while also, quietly, unable to look away. Outside the Newport courthouse, things got stranger. People stripped branches from the trees near the crime scene as souvenirs. A shop near the courthouse reportedly sold Pearl Bryan merchandise. Exactly what kind of merchandise, history is mercifully vague about. But the fact of it sits there, grim and familiar. Grief and commerce have always found each other faster than they should. And underneath all of it, running like a current, was something uglier: the threat of a mob. Pearl Bryan had been well loved in Greencastle. She had family, friends, people who remembered her in her Sunday school classroom and could not reconcile that image with what had been found in a Kentucky field. There were men among them, and women too, probably, who felt that the law was taking too long, moving too carefully, offering too many procedural courtesies to men who deserved none. Jackson and Walling knew it. During a jailbreak at the Newport jail, and yes, there was a jailbreak, because apparently this case had not yet reached its full quota of chaos, the 2 men refused to leave their cell. They stayed put, locked in, and let the other prisoners escape around them. Because outside the walls was a public that wanted them dead in ways the law wasn't yet prepared to deliver. The irony of 2 murderers clinging to the protection of the legal system they'd forced Pearl to need was not lost on observers at the time. March 20th, 1897, Newport, Kentucky. Behind the Campbell County Courthouse on York Street, just south of the Taylor-Southgate Bridge, they built the gallows. The double hanging was rushed, hastened along by the very real fear that if they waited any longer, the crowd would handle the matter themselves. Jackson and Walling were walked out together, which seems almost too on the nose. 2 men who had done everything together now facing the last consequence of it side by side. The drop was designed to be quick, a clean break. The neck, the fall, the end. It didn't go that way. Neither man's neck broke on the initial drop. Instead, they strangled, slowly, in full view, the rope doing its work over several agonizing minutes while the witnesses stood and watched and said nothing. It was gruesome and strange, and somehow entirely fitting for a case that had never once been clean
or simple, or merciful. They were the last people ever hanged in Newport. The gallows were torn down afterward as if the town wanted to pretend it had never needed them. Pearl Bryan's headless body was brought home to Greencastle and buried in the family plot at Forest Hill Cemetery. Her parents buried their daughter in pieces, which is a sentence that should not have to exist and yet does. The grave is still there. People still visit it. The strange afterlife of this story began almost immediately. By the 1910s and 1920s, folk singers had gotten hold of it, the way folk singers always get hold of the things a community can't quite let go of, and turned it into music. Vernon Dalhart recorded a version in 1926. Bradley Kincaid followed in 1927. Dick Burnett and Leonard Rutherford put their own stamp on it. The murder became a song, and then several songs, passed around campfires and front porches across the American South and Midwest. Pearl's name preserved in melody long after the newspapers had moved on to the next tragedy. And then there's Bobby Mackey's Music World, a honky-tonk bar in Wilder, Kentucky, not far from where Pearl's body was found, that has accumulated over the decades a reputation as one of the most haunted locations in America. People report voices, cold spots, presences, a woman in Victorian dress. Whether you believe any of that is entirely your business, but it says something, doesn't it? That the ghost stories attached themselves specifically to this case, to this woman, to this part of Kentucky. Hauntings are how communities remember what they can't resolve. Pearl Bryan's head was never found. Her killer's motive, beyond the brutal arithmetic of a man eliminating a problem, was never fully examined. The canal was drained and came up empty. The furnace theory was never confirmed. Something about this story remains genuinely, permanently open. Scott Jackson was 28 years old when he died on that gallows. He took whatever he knew about where Pearl's head was to whatever comes after. Alonzo Walling was the same age, more or less. The dental college continued operating. The courthouse in Newport is still there. The grave in Greencastle is still there. And somewhere, in the Ohio River or the canal or the ashes of a college furnace long since demolished, there is an absence that has never been filled. Pearl Bryan left Greencastle in custom-made shoes, trusting a man who had already decided she was expendable.
She was identified by those same shoes because he forgot, in all his careful planning, that she had feet, that she had walked places, that she had stood on the earth and left evidence of herself behind the way all of us do, whether we mean to or not. You can take a great deal from a person. You cannot take everything. Leave your thoughts below. Pearl Bryan's case is one of those rare true crime stories where every answer leads to a deeper question. The head was never found. The full truth was never told. We'd genuinely love to know. What do you think happened that night? Do you believe Cal Crim's furnace theory? And if Pearl's ghost really does walk the halls of Bobby Mackey's, can you blame her? Let us know in the comments and tell us where in the world you're watching from. Stories like this one only stay alive because people like you refuse to let them be forgotten.